Okay, welcome. So today I am going to be talking about what is boarding school syndrome. I'm also going to be talking about Joy Schaverien ABCD of boarding school syndrome, and I'm going to talk about a few of the symptoms and the top 5 symptoms that I see in my work with ex-boarders of what boarding school syndrome appears as symptoms. Okay, so this is from Joy Schaverien book, Boarding School Syndrome, the Psychological Trauma of the Privileged Child. And on page 2 she says, boarding school syndrome is not a medical category. However, it is proposed that there is an identifiable cluster of learned behaviours and emotional states that may follow growing up in a boarding school. She goes on to say these men and women as children had to adapt to growing up in an inflexible system and learn to hide their emotions. So that is the basic definition of what boarding school syndrome is. The ABCD of boarding school syndrome: A is abandonment, B is bereavement, C captivity, D is dissociation. So the first 3, and I'll go through these, the first 3, they come from your time at school, and then because of those we then dissociate, and in my work I see that then the dissociation then leads to a lot of the symptoms. We dissociate, so we become avoidant attachment, we become insecurely attached rather than securely attached, which is what we get when we grow up in a good enough parenting environment. So A, abandonment, essentially this means that we're abandoned. We are left to fend for ourselves. As George Monbiot talks about in an article he wrote quite a few years ago, saying that we can't be loved in these environments. So we go from being loved, and then we go into an environment, it's basically he calls it a loveless environment. Yeah. And so, again, this abandonment, we could say from Joy Schaverien again, she says towards the end of the book, she says the lack of appropriate physical contact for extended periods of time in childhood is a serious deprivation. Serious deprivation. So this abandonment, we've been abandoned. And I'm just going to quote a few different people. This is from Prince Harry's book, and what he says he's talking about one of his teachers ringing the bell at prep school, and he says, abandoned children don't care about a bell. Abandoned children don't care about a bell. So I thought that was very telling in there. So then we move on to bereavement. So again, in Joy Schaverien words, she says, homesickness has been reframed as bereavement. What this means is, homesickness is almost like you go away on holiday and you miss your home and then you go back home, but it's like this pang. Whereas what she's saying, and what I found in my work, Nick Duffel says the similar thing, is that you lose everything when you go to boarding school. You lose your parents, yeah, but also your siblings. You lose your comfortable, safe room if you have one. Food, which is palatable. Safety, your toys, your pets, your friends at home. You lose a lot. You don't just lose your parents or your home, you lose everything. So she's saying it needs to be reframed as bereavement. And again, if I was to quote a few people, so Bear Grylls' book, he says here, I missed my mum and dad terribly, and on the occasional night where I felt this worst, I remember trying to muffle my tears in my pillow whilst the rest of the dormitory slept. In fact, I was not alone in doing this. Almost everyone cried, but we all learned to hide it, and those who didn't were the ones who got bullied. Yeah, so that's Bear Grylls. And then this is from Sir Ranulph Fiennes. Him talking about his boarding school. So he's a British explorer. He says, while my mother house hunted, I was packed off to my new English prep school in purple blazer and cap and grey flannels. After sobbing into my pillow for the first week, I came to enjoy Sandroyd School in Wiltshire, as it transformed itself from a hostile planet into an exciting playground. So yeah, after sobbing into my pillow for the first weeks. And David Cameron also talks about that, the ex-British Prime Minister, saying that he used to look at pictures of his family in this globe, this square kind of pictures of them, and cry, sobbing in. So then the third thing is about captivity, so C for captivity. And again, what she says in her book, she says the institutional life of boarding school has been reframed as captivity. Essentially, we can't leave. We need permission to leave. And, if you say, I'm homesick, you still can't leave. If you run away, they bring you back. For me, in my experience of boarding school, the only two ways you could leave one was expulsion, and the second way was suicide. And I saw both of those at my school. So again, captivity. If I talk about Bear Grylls again, he says here, I remember all of us in our dormitory counting down the days like prisoners until the next exeat or weekend at home. Boy, they took a long time to come round, and man, when the glorious weekends would go past quickly. Conversely, those Sunday night drives back to school were truly torturous. Give me SAS selection any day. And that was bad, trust me. So that captivity, it's like, wow, worse than SAS selection day. And then obviously in here, Stephen Fry, he also talks about captivity. He says, prisons are like boarding schools. So again, using that terminology. And then the fourth aspect of this is then the dissociation. We learn to dissociate. We leave our bodies. We go up into our heads. We kind of stop feeling. As Joy Schaverien says, as the men and women, as children, learn to hide their emotions, so that we dissociate. So those are the ABCD of boarding school syndrome. And then what are some of the symptoms? So in my work, I have seen that the most consistent, common symptoms are, first one is to do with dissociation. We dissociated from our emotions. So we can go through life, it might be quite stressful, we just don't feel anything. But this is a real problem, as I'll come into in a bit, in relationships. If we can't feel, one, we can't connect with our vulnerability or our emotions, but also we can't connect with empathy. And if we're in positions of power, as so many of our leaders are, who've been to boarding school, we can't have empathy because we can't connect with what they're feeling. So that's really the first thing I see as a symptom of an ex-boarder, is we struggle to know what we're feeling in any given moment. We can think about it, but to go, what do you feel? I feel some fear, So then the second thing I've noticed is workaholism. Nick Duffel talks about this idea of timetabling in boarding schools. We've just got to keep going. And this comes from around the 19th century, that the boarding schools were quite wild places. So they basically brought in that now you've got to be doing stuff all the time. So what this means when we leave boarding school is that we can't stop doing. We're just trained. We feel very comfortable at work setting, but then when we're on holiday, we stop. We don't like it, because then the emotions start to come up. So we start getting busy again. Busy. So in our 20s, 30s, as ex-boarders, we can really thrive. We can do really well in business and be a real success. But when we've pushed our emotions down, when we get to the late 30s, 40s, into our 50s, it's not possible to push this down, and we can, some of the symptoms are sickness, depression, suicidal ideation. These types of things come forth. And Judith Herman, in her book Trauma and Recovery, says this, that it's often in the third and the fourth decade that the trauma resurfaces. The third symptom of boarding school syndrome for me is to do with relationships. We struggle in intimate relationships. As I mentioned earlier, we become, shut down emotionally, and we become avoidant attachment. Most ex-boarders are avoidant, insecure. You've also got disorganized, and you've got ambivalent. I see probably 80 to 90% of the people I work with are avoidant attachment. What does that mean? It means you keep intimacy at arm's length. Stay away from me. We struggle with our emotions, and therefore someone says, how are you feeling? This next thing why we struggle in intimate relationships is that we've learnt that we can't trust anyone. We can't trust those we love. They're going to let us down, and therefore we project that onto relationships. Oh no, I can't get close to you because you're going to just abandon me. Another thing with that is that we become selfish. We disappear inside ourselves. That's what happens with trauma. We disappear inside ourselves, and therefore in relationships we're not giving. So one of the remedies is that we start to give again. We've got to start giving back. So another of the two symptoms that I've noticed quite common with my clients, one is anxiety. A lot of us, I think, as Nick Duffel says in one of the workshops I did with Nick, he said, where was it? Yeah, majority of survivors are not conscious. They suddenly discover how anxious they are. And I've had this quite a bit. I started working with clients and suddenly they're like, oh my God, I've got this anxiety. And the reason we have that, in my opinion, is that because we have to be real flatliners at school, we can't be too up, we can't be too down. Therefore, any form of excitement is seen as a bad thing, and we put a lid on it, and that turns into anxiety. There's been quite a lot of research in neuroscience, psychology, that when we feel anxious, it's just the negative expression of excitement. And if we can reframe that by saying, when you feel anxiety, I feel excited, we actually perform at a much higher level. So that's the fourth one, is anxiety. And I'd say another of the symptoms, I would say, is, there's lots of them, but I'd say the one which comes to me now, off the top of my head, is triggers. We get triggered quite easily. If someone criticizes us or something happens, we can be quite controlling, and therefore we can get triggered quite easily. So that would be the fifth one. So yeah, lots of thoughts here. Thank you so much for listening. So this is what is boarding school syndrome, the ABCD of boarding school syndrome, and some of the symptoms. So if this resonates, you say, oh yeah, really resonates with me, please do comment below and like this video as well, and please do share and subscribe to my videos. I upload once a week a regular video on Wednesday, and then I usually put a podcast on the Friday. Sometimes it's every week, but mostly it's every 2 weeks. This Friday I've got a podcast about trauma and sex, and then I'm interviewing next week a well-known author called Richard Grannon to talk about narcissism and complex PTSD. I've also got this workshop which is happening where I'm going to be talking in a lot more depth about boarding school syndrome and what it is and how we heal. That is going to be in 10 days time, and I'll put a link to the workshop in the description. So yeah, any questions, please let me know.